If you've ever combined images inside of Photoshop, you'll know the shadows make or break the image. You see, there's three things you need to understand about light and one additional thing that I'm going to show you. Once you understand these things, when you composite images or do collages and put them together, they're going to look so much more realistic. Your objects are going to be nicely anchored and not just floating in space. Hey Cafe crew, it's Colin Smith here from photoshopCAFE.com, the very best place to learn Photoshop and Lightroom. Also check me out on Instagram at photoshopCAFE. So today we're going to be talking about shadows. Shadows are a very popular topic. I've had lots and lots of questions about them. So today we're going to composite a dinosaur into a city. The purpose of this really is to teach some principles. There's three things I'm going to teach you about light. Once you understand that, your shadows are going to be correct. Then I've got an additional tip that I'm going to show you as well. Now, I'm curious, is this the first of my tutorials you've ever seen, or have you watched my tutorials before? Add a comment and let me know when you first did one of my tutorials. So anyway, the images we're going to use here, we've got an image here from San Francisco, and we've got a picture of a dinosaur. Now, these came from Adobe Stock, and I'm going to give you a link underneath where you can grab 10 free images and try out Adobe Stock for yourself. It's a great way to get photographs and objects that you can bring into Photoshop, play around with them, and then if you like them, you can license them and use them in your commercial project. So right now, what we've got is we've just got a dinosaur on white. So the first thing we need to do is cut it out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I've got another tutorial I'm going to link right now. 3 methods for cutting things out. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use a quick selection tool just to give you a quick idea. So we're just selecting the white, holding down the shift key, selecting in there. So basically we've selected the white and then we just want to mask it out. So we're going to hit the Alt or the Option key and we're going to create a mask. Now this isn't perfect. I've created one here where I spent a little more time. Once again, check out that tutorial. And what we're going to do is we're going to drag this into the San Francisco image. So I'm just going to close out the other one because we don't need it. So what we're going to do is we're going to click and drag, making sure we're selecting our object, and I'm going to move it into the tab. I'm not releasing yet. Notice as I'm hovering over that tab, the destination image now appears. So I'm just going to move over. I haven't released my cursor yet. Now, if I want to center it, I'll hold down the Shift key, release, and there we go. Now we've got our object right in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it down a little bit. So I'm just hitting the Alt or the Option key and just using the scroll wheel to zoom out. And I'm going to hit Control or Command T. All right, so let's hit the corner here. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key to constrain it, Option or Alt key to adjust it from the middle. So we're going to drop it down and let's make the dinosaur about that big. So that's going to be nice and big. And I'm just going to hit the Enter key to apply it. And I just hit Control 0 now to go full screen. All right, what I'm going to do to talk about these principles is I'm just going to create a white layer for now. And I'm just going to put that underneath our dinosaur. And we're going to use this to explain how light works. Okay, so if the light would be coming in this direction, it would be hitting the front of the object, and therefore these areas would be occluded, and the shadow would be on the other side going away. Number 1, direction. What direction is the light coming from? Is it a light? Is it a sun? The light source is over here, and therefore it's coming this way. Everything facing it is gonna be illuminated. Everything on the other side of it is going to be occluded or in shadow. So the shadow is going to go in the opposite direction of the light. So the way to find out what direction the light source is when you're looking at things is to look for shadows. And we can see some self shadow here under that leg there. We can see that shadow, which means the light is coming from here, but maybe a little bit higher because you can see under the tail there. So the light's hitting there. So maybe the light is actually coming from more this direction. And therefore this is going to be all in light. And the opposite side is going to be in shadow. The second thing is the quality of light. Now that doesn't mean is this high quality, expensive light or cheap light. What it means is how diffuse is this light. So say for example, if it's something like the sun on a bright sunny day, it's going to be a very small light source, which means it's going to be very harsh, which means the edges of the shadows are going to be very sharp. Now, if it's an overcast day, then that light's going to be more diffuse, meaning that the light particles are scattered more, and the edges of those shadows are going to be softer. And the third thing, not to be confused with the quality, is the quantity. If it's a very bright light source, then the shadows are going to be darker. If it's a lighter light source and not so much contrast between that and the environment, then the shadows are going to be more faint or more transparent. Once you understand these three things, it's easy to know what direction to put the shadow, how soft to make them, and how dark to make them. So now I've deleted the other layers and we're just going into our dinosaur right now. So let's look at the technique for creating the shadow. So what we want to do is create a drop shadow. So we're just going to go down to the effects here, click, and we're going to see an option to create a drop shadow. So we're going to do this first. Now, let me just drag the shadow out of the way a little bit. Notice I can drag on the document and that'll change the distance and the angle. It's easier just to drag on it, we can see that. So what we're trying to decide is how soft should this shadow be. So if we turn the size all the way down, it's going to be a very hard-edged shadow. But if we look inside our scene, it's not matching our scene. Look at the shadow under the car, and under these cars, it's a little bit softer. So I'm just going to move my size up to match. Very, very simple. And now we know that this is kind of the diffuse, and now we can see that that's a softer shadow. And if we look into our scene here, we can see it's kind of an overcast day, so that would be creating a slightly softer edge shadow than if it had been a very bright sunny day. And once again, the big clue is to just look into the photo and see what the other shadows are doing. Alright, so what I want to do now is I want to affix that right to the bottom, and rather than trying to drag that into position, just take our distance to 0. And we know our size is 16, that's our softness. So increasing the size will make it softer, decreasing will make it harder. And now we're just going to click OK to apply it. Alright, so what we've done is we've now set the quality of our shadow. The next thing we want to do is we want to set the direction of our shadow. So what we need to do is separate this drop shadow into its own layer. And the way to do that is to right click and you'll see something that says Create Layer. And when I click on Create Layer, notice now we get the shadow as its own layer. That separates a layer effect from the object. And this is great. Now we can move it around. But what we want to do is we want to transform it. So the way to do it is to make sure we're selecting our shadow. And then we're going to hit Control-T for free transform. Command-T on Mac. And that'll bring up these little handles. So what we want to do now is right-click. And then we're going to choose to distort. Distort lets us move these handles independently, and that's what we want to do. Alright, so I want my shadow to kind of come back behind the dinosaur, maybe a little bit off to the side there. Because if I look under the car, you can see there, it's actually coming pretty much straight down. So we're going to kind of cheat just a little bit because I want to really show you how to do this shadow. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull it down on either side, and we're going to bring it all the way down. Now, in a situation like this, it's going to be kind of flat. So we'd be looking at something like this. A very kind of flat shadow because the light is kind of coming from above. And notice how I can grab the here and I can just drag it around to get the right position. Now, what's important is to make sure these feet are lined up. So I'm going to make sure that's right there. And we're looking at this one here. There we go. That's not bad. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit. So forgive me for going a little bit out of science, but I want to show you some other techniques, and it'll be easier for me to do this, to drag it out a little bit. So technically, the shadow should be a little bit flatter, but I'm going to drag it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just set that up right there. Notice I'm anchoring the feet on this side, and on this side I want to do the same thing. And now I'm going to hit enter. Alright, so we've created the shadow. The next thing we could do is just drop the opacity down to kind of match. And at this point here, what we would have is we would have our direction. We would have our quality, which is the softness of the edge. And we would have our quantity or our intensity, which is, the shade of gray that we're setting to. But there's one more thing that's going to make this shadow realistic. Okay, here's the tip. And this is the thing that's going to make your shadows very realistic. And that's something called shadow fall off. And that happens in the real world. Let me describe. So say we have a background. And we have an object here. There's a light source coming from there. That light is coming down. It's hitting this pen. And if I look at it, it creates a shadow on there. Notice the further my object, which would be our dinosaur in this case a pen. So the further the object is away from the background that it's casting the shadow onto, the softer that shadow is and the lighter that shadow is. As it gets closer, that shadow becomes hard-edged and dark, especially if it's right on it. But in the real world, things are not really lying flat. Things are like this. And then if we look at it here, notice that the tip of this pen is darker and harder, and as it gets towards the other end, notice that shadow diffuses, becomes softer and lighter. So that's called shadow fall off, and now we're going to apply it to our image. And now we want to create a little bit of this fall off. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hit the Q key for quick mask. Or we could click this little button here. Notice that. You'll know you're in quick mask because it'll say quick mask up the top there. So what I want to do is I want to create a gradual selection in here, and the quick mask is the way to do it. So I'm going to grab my gradient tool here. I'm going to hit the D key to make sure it's set foreground to background, which is black to white, linear gradient, opacity 100, and linear right there. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to create that fall off. So we want it to start very close to there and go up to the end of our object. So if we just click and drag up, what I'm doing is I'm now creating a gradient that runs through there. See that? Now you don't necessarily see that gradient right now, you're just seeing the mask. So all I got to do now is hit the Q key for quick mask. And what it's done now is it's created a gradient mask. Now notice that my selection is in the top half here. If yours isn't, choose select inverse. So if yours is selected at the bottom here instead of the top, inverse that selection. And now what we're going to do is we're going to apply a blur. And because we got the gradient, it's going to apply that gradient on the blur. So if we choose filter blur, and then we grab our Gaussian blur, notice what happens. So instead of blurring that entire shadow now, what we're doing is notice it blurs more the further away it gets, and it's sharper the closer it gets. And we can go up to a little bit higher maybe. There, it's looking good. Now in areas like this, maybe the gradient isn't getting it so much. We could blur that manually later if we wanted. I'm going to take that down just a little bit. There we go. It's looking good. And now I'm going to click OK. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to make it a little bit more transparent the further it gets away. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we can use the same selection. And this is one of the few times I would say that it's okay to use the eraser tool. I'm going to grab the eraser tool, make sure I'm in brush mode. We can choose a soft edge selection, not that it matters in this case. And I want to take the opacity down to about 10%. And now I'm going to erase on that shadow. And notice as I erase it a couple of times, that gradient is enabling us to create that gradual fade out. So now I'm just going to turn off the selection, Control D or Command D on Mac. And we've just got a little bit here that we might want to soften, and we could just grab our blur tool to do that. Let's just go here, grab our blur tool, and I'm just going to create a white background so you can clearly see what's going on here. So we can see there's our shadow there, and if we hide our dinosaur, you can see that's what we did with our shadow. So one thing I can do to make this look more realistic is add a little bit of depth of field blur. So I'm going to choose the background here. So I'm going to go to Filter, I'm going to go to Blur Gallery, and then Field Blur. And then what will happen here is I can choose how much blur I want to add. So we want to really make the background out of focus, or maybe just a little bit softer. I'm thinking about theirs looking nice. And all we're trying to do is just create a little separation between the background and our object. That looks good. But notice at the front here, it looks weird because the background is completely out of focus here and our dinosaur is in focus. So I'm just going to click to add a second point. And I want to set that to 0. So if I Control or Command click and double click on there, that'll set that to 0. And notice now we've got this nice gradual depth of field that goes there. So I'm curious, how many of these techniques are new to you? Let me know in the comments underneath. And by the way, don't forget your free 10 images from Adobe Stock in the link underneath. And another thing you might want to consider is signing up to become a contributor to Adobe Stock. That way you can contribute your photographs and videos. You can earn a little bit of extra revenue and also get your images in front of millions of people. I'm going to put a link underneath where you can become a contributor. It's very easy to sign up. So anyway, guys, if you like this tutorial, smash that like button into dust. If you enjoy these kind of tutorials, every single week I do a new one. Hit the subscribe button and that little bell notification, and then you'll know whenever I upload a new video. And if you'd like to learn more about compositing, there's a ton of tutorials at photoshopCAFE.com, but there's 2 premium tutorials I want to recommend. One is done by myself, which is the Sky City project, Compositing Secrets Inside of Photoshop, where I'm walking through an entire project start to finish. And then there's another title that I would recommend from Karen Alsop, where she did a Hey Diddle Diddle project, which is a lot of fun, and that's compositing inside of Photoshop. So if you want to check those out, I'll put the link in there underneath for you to have a look at those titles. And until the next time, I'll see you at the cafe.